So let's talk about mindset. Obviously, to let go of the subjective and focus on the objective when it comes to profit is not always easy, especially when you can be so focused on sales because you see it as the conductor engine that's really leading everything and pulling the weight of the business. You can have that shiny object syndrome with sales as well and look at the big numbers and think that it's all gravy from there. But there are a lot of limiting beliefs. I know one of them that you've talked about in the past is go to the ocean with a spoon or a bucket. It doesn't care.
Right.
What do you see with most business owners? How do most people think about money in terms of profit?
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, and I'm not sure our audience would be among those who disagree, but there are still people, two P's there, people. The reason it's on my mind is a couple of weeks ago I had a conversation with somebody, and they were saying things like, well, I want to make a profit, but I don't want to make too much, and I don't want to gouge people. And of course not. We can talk about what gouging is. If you don't use coercion, theft, or deception, and somebody wants to buy what you've got and they're willing to pay for it, you are not gouging anybody, right? But anyway, it brought up that idea of profit, short of cash, but we're just talking profit. And it brought to mind an incident I had, and it'd be in the 90s. But at the time, I was a contractor, and I was working at a professor's house. And his wife backed out of the garage while I was standing in the driveway, and she said, "Are you okay if I leave for a while?" And I said, "Sure." And she said she had a Subaru. Actually, it was a Subaru. And the back was filled with wine bottles. And she said, "I've got to run these to the recycling center." I said, "Fine, we can get along." She came back in about a half an hour, and the bottles were still in the back of her Subaru. She got out and she said, "Well, they don't recycle bottles anymore." And she did air quotes, and she kind of had a cynical look on her face, and she said, "There's no profit in it." And I resisted the temptation to tell her, "What a great opportunity. You can go open your own recycling center," right? So I'm trust that most of the people that are listening to us understand the importance of profit as the stage right before more cash. But there are a lot of people who think that profit is evil, that somebody's getting ripped off, that profit is a manifestation of greed, and it's earned on the backs by ripping off consumers and employees. And I want to not be contemptuous of that. I want to say, okay, how would I deal with that? Well, the first thing is that their concept of profit being a ripoff, it is a manifestation of the fixed pie syndrome. And the fixed pie syndrome, I think most people have heard of and are aware of, but it's the idea that if somebody has a bigger slice, somebody has to have a smaller slice. So how is it possible that somebody could sell something at a profit and it could benefit both parties? And I have to admit that if you think about it, not very deeply, but if you think about it, yeah, that kind of makes sense. If I buy something from somebody and they make a profit on it, then that profit is what I paid too much for that product. They gain, I lose. But that makes it seem as that's not true. What my point is that profit is a way that both parties can benefit to a transaction. You say, well, how can that be? The seller makes a profit, the buyer does not. And I want to just use an example and say, let's take an example of a cobbler who makes shoes and somebody who buys shoes, you and all of us. If we thought how much less we could do in a week if we had to make our own shoes, right? The cobbler's been doing it for a long time. He's pretty good at it. He has the tools. He knows where to buy leather. He buys so much leather that he actually buys it as a discount. He knows how to make shoes. And so he can make a pair of really nice dress shoes for $50. And he sells them to you for $100. Have you been ripped off? Not at all. And the reason you haven't is that for you to make those shoes, you would have had to learn to where to source leather, how to grade leather. You wouldn't have bought in big quantities. Have to buy the tools. You have to buy the shop. You'd have to buy the patterns. You'd have to learn how to do it. It'd probably take your third, fourth attempt before you could even wear them. So you would have spent many more dollars than 100 in wasted time and resources trying to make your own shoes. So the cobbler, by making his $50 profit, has benefited you by avoiding maybe several $500, $600, $700 worth of expenses, and most importantly, your time, which you could use to sell what you're good at. And that, if I've told that well enough to make sense, that saved time and energy and resources of the cobbler's skill, freeing you up to have shoes and to work elsewhere, is entirely achieved by savings of waste of materials and waste of time. And it is that savings of material and time that account for the benefit of profit to both parties. And in fact, it accounts for all the wealth that we see around us. We use cobblers and shoes as something that we could maybe even in our wild imagination imagine that we could make our own shoes. But how about your iPhone, right? It's safe to say you will never, ever, ever build your own iPhone or your computer. And you may say, well, I built a computer because I bought a chip and I bought the circuit board. Oh, where did the chip come from? And where did the transistors and the ideas and the ability and the engineering behind the transistors that go on that chip come from? Anyway, it is all due to what Adam Smith in 1776 called specialization or division of labor and specialization. And that accounts for the great abundance that we see all around us. I made a point in my book in the very last chapter that there is nothing on the face of the earth that wasn't here and available to our caveman ancestors 10,000 or 100,000 years ago. There's nothing here. Actually, I put a footnote in my book. There is something here that wasn't here 10,000 years ago. The Earth attracts about 40,000 tons of space dust every year. So the Earth grows by about 40,000 tons a year, minus what we blast off in our rockets, right? So there is a net gain. But the point is, there's nothing available to us that wasn't available to our caveman ancestors, but we live so much differently. I mean, it's so ridiculously differently that it's not even necessarily worth trying to point out the magnitude of the change. And it's all come from people getting better at what they do and being able to sell something at a profit, and we'll talk about how they use that profit, which also benefited the buyer who paid the profit but saved his own time and energy and resources by buying it from you rather than trying to make it himself. And that is the temporal source of abundance. That's it. Yeah. That's where it comes from. I will throw out one last thing because I read Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations in 1770. No, I didn't read it in 1776.
You read it in 1776. Wow.
Yeah. Man, it was a long time ago. I wrote it then, but he gives 3 reasons that contractors, most certainly, and manufacturers will understand of where that benefit comes from. And he says it's saving in setups times, right? So if I'm making 1,000 pairs of shoes, I set up a row and a process and can crank them out. So setup times, dexterity of the workman, which means in his language, in our language, means they get better and better at doing what they've done. So he's a skilled cobbler and I'm not. And the third one is innovation. People who are at something begin to see opportunities of how to improve it. And in Adam Smith, I think he actually talks about a guy in the mills in England in the 1700s, and there's a lever that cranks every time the guy pulls it. He pulls it, and then pretty soon he's looking at it, and he realizes if he takes a chain from this piece to that piece, the machine will pull the lever, and he doesn't have to do anything, right? So that's a very, very simple, but I think our people will understand, our listeners will understand that the idea of saving on setup times, the skill of that, the dexterity of the workman, and innovation, which extends beyond machines to processes and technology, are the sources of abundance.